Hi everybody, this is Nathan Donnelly with Northwest Resilience, and I am doing a series of videos right now on disaster preparedness in general, and more specifically about this pandemic that we have going on right now. And I'm trying to kind of cover topics as they come to me in my life, but also prioritizing the ones that I think are most important for us all to be considering. With any disaster, there are basic needs that need to be met for any person, for any living thing, really. And I'm going to try and be ticking those things off. And right now, I'm thinking a lot about food. I've been doing a lot myself to bring more food into my own home. And I'm actually filming right now from the greenhouse just outside of my place here, and because it's raining today, so this is the best way to be outside and inside at the same time. But so this one is going to be about survival crops. This is going to be about making food out of the soil and out of seeds. Yesterday I did a video that you can check out on getting beyond the mentality of just buying rice and beans. You can look up on my channel the video Beyond Rice and Beans, what it really takes to be healthy for the coming pandemic. And I go at length into really thinking about more nutrient-dense foods in addition to the starchy foods that everybody seems to gravitate towards. In this one here, I wear a few hats in the world, and in addition to teaching survival and disaster preparedness, I'm actually a permaculture designer. I've had a permaculture design business called Reverence Permaculture for close to 15 years now, and it's always been a one-man show, just kind of me helping out clients, doing implementation of projects, designing projects, and a lot of consultation, a lot of just kind of showing up and introducing people to their own plot of land in a lot of cases, and just pointing out the things that I tend to notice. In addition to that, because I am a super busy guy and I don't have a lot of money as a general rule, when I'm growing a garden, it's not a hobby for me. It's got to put food on the table, and it's got to do it with a minimum of expense and a minimum of fuss, a minimum of labor from me, because I'm off somewhere. And my region for where I have gardened all my life, I grew up in eastern Washington. I lived for 10 years in Northern California, and now I'm on an island off of the west coast of Washington. So this is slightly maritime, pretty gentle, but it's pretty much all been temperate northwest Mediterranean climates with very dry summers and then typically very wet winters. So that's my own background. I've been an avid gardener just about my whole life. I've actually not gardened a whole lot in these last few years because I've been bouncing around and I've been on a loan and all these other things. So this is a garden that I'm peripherally involved with, mostly with building up infrastructure. Like I built this potting table here for my friend Jan, who does most of the gardening here. But I do other projects that you'll see here as well, including a tunnel house behind me that I'll probably do a video on. But so this video is combining permaculture with disaster preparedness, and I'm basing a lot of it on a book that I read quite a few years ago that just really affected me. Actually was introduced to this book when I took my first permaculture design course, 10 years ago now, I bet, called Gardening When It Counts. I forget the author's name right now, but she wrote the book because she had cared for her mother who was dealing with cancer for like 3 years, and went from being a woman who had, just the most outrageous gardens, could really throw herself into it, to somebody who was trying to work a job and take care of her mother and deal with a whole lot of stress that involved and still grow food. So she really whittled herself down to like, what is the real nugget of what I need to be growing in order to make it through? And she hit the nail right on the head. So I'm gonna base a lot of this and expand on book a bit, but I really recommend buying a copy of that book. Imagine wherever you are, if your bookstores are closed where you are and you're supposed to be isolating, then it's worth ordering online. It's a very good book. So my survival crops here, I've got about 8 or 9 of them, and then I'm gonna list some honorable mentions on there too. But I've got some criteria that I'm gonna go off of, and I should mention before this, I'll mention it again at the end of the video, that I have been doing consulting for people over the phone while we're doing the social distancing. So if you have any questions about gardening and permaculture, homesteading as a rule, if any disaster preparedness, I can go through a point-by-point list that I have been using for years to kind of analyze your own home, family, systems, vehicles, all those things. And then also, general survival skills. I am available for. I've halved my rate through this pandemic because it's just too important to make sure. It's too important, and I need to get out to people. I'm a teacher, in my blood, and right now I just feel really lit up about that. So that's why I'm hopping back into doing videos again as well. So I'll talk about that again later, but you can jot down in the notes below my video if you would like to have a phone call. My rates are half right now, and it's a really good time. It's March to start thinking about, if you haven't already, like kicking butt in your garden. So my criteria for what I'm going with in this list of foods, vegetables, is it's got to be widely growable throughout North America. Whoever's going to be watching this, that would include a lot of Europe too, I suppose. But so it's got to be, if you live anywhere in the United States, you're going to be able to grow this. Your season might be off, depending on if you're north or south of me or less maritime than I am, but there is going to be a variety of this crop that will grow and grow well where you live. You can rest assured on all these things I'm going to mention, except maybe for some of the honorable mentions. It's got to be a staple crop. So as a general rule, gardeners are really great at growing super bright, colorful salads, and that's fantastic. I try to have a salad a day in my diet. That's a really nutrient-dense food, but it's not a staple crop. The whole saying, "the West wasn't won on salad," is true. It's pretty easy to grow salads in addition to these two. So I'm going to say, in addition to your, leafy greens and your brights, thises and that's, you need to bulk that out with something. So these are all going to be staple crops. They've got to be nutrient-dense. A lot of these things might be, like I'm going to talk about potatoes later, might be thinking, oh, that's just empty calories. Some of these things you need to eat with the skin on, like for potatoes, and they become incredibly nutritious at that point. They need to store well. No brainer. Store well usually means travel well too, in case you need to switch locations. And they need to be versatile, meaning you can use them in a variety of different meals, cuisines, whatever way you like to cook. This thing is probably going to work in it one way or another. So I'm going to start out with probably the most famous 3 of all I'm going to talk about, and these happen to grow really well together. In permaculture, we have a term known as a guild, and a guild is a suite of species that can be put together, and they're like a mini ecosystem. The different parts of that system, or the different species within it, all benefit off of each other. So the Three Sisters Guild is ancient, for one. It comes from Native Americans, I think down in the Southwest, where it started the whole system. But it has to do with these 3 plants, when they're grown together, actually all benefit each other. So I'm going to start the first leg of that tripod of the Three Sisters Guild is beans, and particularly pole beans or runner beans. Beans are a good crop to grow because they are a nitrogen fixer, which is good for your soil, and also means it's high in protein. So if you're going to be eating beans with some other kind of starchy food, like rice, potatoes, corn, a lot of your grains, etc., those 2 things will combine to create a complete protein. I think a lot of people know that very few plants in and of themselves are a complete protein for what the human body needs. But if you can combine a legume with a grain, then you end up with a complete protein as a general rule of thumb. So in addition to that, like I said, they're nitrogen fixing, meaning they are pumping nitrogen out of the atmosphere via bacteria in their root system into the soil. So the other plants that you're going to be growing alongside them or after you harvest them are going to benefit from the addition of nitrogen in that soil. I am personally, I'm just going to put this right out there, I am a no-dig gardener. I do not like to disturb the soil. I like to mulch heavy and deep with whatever I can get my hands on, and that has worked well for me in super hot climates in California and in maritime wet climates in western Washington, and maritime climates in California as well. I just find that to be such a great combination. It's how Mother Nature works. Mulch from the top down, not constantly digging up the soil. I like the worms to be tilling my soil, and the best way I can grow worms is with mulch and no-till digging. Just putting that out there. I recommend looking into those, and maybe I'll end up doing a video on it at some point, but I'm not in my own garden space right now to where I can really feel comfortable doing that. So that's beans in a nutshell. Lots of variety for beans. You can get dry beans, and then you can get the green bean style. Those can be canned. The dry beans are dried, and they last indefinitely. So they are very productive crops, and they're benefiting all of your other crops. Next in that is corn. Corn is another plant that has got a lot of variety in it. And back to the book Gardening When It Counts, the woman who wrote it is she has celiacs, I believe it was. She can't eat wheat at any rate. So a lot of these things, and I actually used to be very gluten intolerant myself until I was on alone and I cured my gut out there. So I wasn't eating wheat either. So she has really gone down into all these different varieties of corn that can be ground into flour, can be eaten like sweet corn, that can be used as animal feed, that can, all the ways corn is used. She was growing varieties of corn that she could make flour out of, that she could make sandwich bread with. Like bread you could eat a sandwich with, not crumbly cornbread. So there's a lot of variety in corn. Again, like beans, it dries and it stores for a really long time. I also like to grow corn because it's such a big plant that it's got a lot of biomass, and because I am a mulch gardener, I like biomass. I like something that's putting a lot of plant material out that I can put back onto the ground. I typically do chop and drop. You won't see my gardens looking like fancy English gardens. There is just plant material on the ground, composting in place, and feeding my plants. But I'm going to go into a little bit the importance of mulch. Mulch is like a blanket for the earth. A lot of the metabolizing in biological activity that happens in a plant is going on underground in the root system, as it should be. The soil itself is a wildly complex place. There are tens of thousands of different species of soil organism that are feeding your plant, that are keeping it safe from diseases, that are moving nutrients around, myriad dozens other activities that I probably don't even know about half of them. But you want to encourage that. And when you have bare soil, you've got some problems. One, exposure to the sun and the wind. So you're losing moisture like crazy, okay? Two, exposure to the sun and the cold. So you've got temperature fluctuations that are like this, night and day, seasonally, all those things. That's not good for metabolizing, for the metabolism of the plants, nor all those microorganisms. So that's a problem. Three, you have just laid open the buffet for every weed you don't want to have. Weeds, as a rule, are disturbed soil species specialists. I was an invasive weeds crew coordinator, crew boss for almost 5 years, for over 5 years in California, and that's where you go to find invasive weeds, is where the soil has been disturbed. It's been compacted, it's been tilled up, it's been run over by heavy equipment, whatever, floods, that sort of thing. So you want to avoid that in your garden if you don't like to weed, if you don't like to do work. And best way to do that I'm aware of is mulching. So there's the weeds, the temperature fluctuation, the retaining moisture, and then the fourth one is nutrient value. You are putting nutrients right back into the ground where the root system of the plants are, and that's where it needs to be. You're encouraging this microbiotic engine that is feeding all these plants. So mulching, you practically can't use too much of it. There's a lot of materials that can use it. Pretty much the only mulch plant material that I avoid is coniferous tree waste, and that's only in the case of, well, and I even use that, I should say, if I'm doing acid-loving plants. Coniferous tree waste breaks down to more acidic soil. Certain plants like blueberries, a lot of berries actually like that, azaleas, roses, you can look into that your own self. But I'm a big fan of mulching. For a survival garden, it is super clutch. You have got to mulch. The last leg of that Three Sisters Guild is squash. Squash, you have summer squash, you have winter squash. The winter squash keeps for ages, for months, through the winter. And if you are eating, I just learned this from Juanita's video that she did a few days ago, the squashes with the really bright orange flesh are very high in vitamin A, which is very important for having a good, strong immune system. So that's another side benefit, is the nutritional value of squash is really good for some things that aren't necessarily easy to get in other foods. So I highly recommend squash and a variety of squash, and they're easy to grow, and they will. There's a joke in 2 or 3 of the communities I've lived in my lifetime that during zucchini season, everybody locks their doors, because if you don't, you'll come back to your car and you'll find it full of zucchini, because gardeners are just growing way more than they can eat. So summer squash and winter squash, both great crops. Winter squash is a long keeper. Other crops beyond the Three Sisters, cabbage. Cabbage is, it's not a long keeper like corn or beans is, but it does keep for a very long time. And if you want to ferment it, it keeps for a very, very long time. And fermentation and drying your food are the two best ways to retain the nutritive value of your food. Freezing, ways that preserve food that involve temperature fluctuations, like freezing and canning, they work really well, they're great, but they do destroy some of the nutrients with those temperature fluctuations. So that's a problem. And it can be, when you dry foods, you actually do it at fairly low temperatures. I have a food dryer going right now upstairs in my place, and it's set at 110 degrees or something like that, with a fan going on it to dry all the nettles that I collected yesterday. So those two methods, and then fermenting doesn't have any temperature fluctuation needed at all. But learn how to make sauerkraut, learn how to make kimchi. There's a million different recipes you can use for those, and it's actually kind of a good way to utilize a lot of other vegetables that you might have extra of that you can fold into that. But cabbage, it's dense, it's heavy, it's got bulk. It's not necessarily high in calories, but it checks all the other boxes, so it's definitely in there. Potatoes. Potatoes is kind of like the number one. My last name is Donnelly, so I've got some Irish blood in me. But potatoes are kind of the survival food. They grow a ton. They're something you can basically stick in the ground and forget about, and then if you put it in the right place, you can come back and have a crop of food that you didn't do anything but stick something in the ground. And I honestly, I will use potatoes. I don't go to the bother of buying seed potatoes on all that half the time. I will use potatoes that started to grow eyes on them or something because I didn't get to them in time from the store or from ones that I'd grown or whatever, and I will find a little niche in the environment around my home that's going to get decent sun, and mulch it and call it good. And I have heard of guerrilla gardeners in Alaska that, because the sun comes in at such a steep angle in Alaska, they will plant their potatoes at the feet of alder trees. Alder is the most nitrogen-fixing plant we know of on Earth, and you could put plants underneath there. Alder is also a water pump. It actually brings moisture from deeper in the soil higher up to the topsoil. It's a very beneficial tree to have in your environment. So they'll just put potatoes in there underneath alder trees and walk away, and a couple months later they come back and harvest mad potatoes. So for guerrilla gardening, potatoes are really clutch. I could go on and on about potatoes. One thing about potatoes, though, you need to eat the potato skins. If you're the person who peels your potatoes to make mashed potatoes and all that, you are throwing away 90% of the value of that food, okay? And I've got a story to relate to about that. The Irish potato famine, which killed and displaced millions of people. Before the potato famine, the population in Ireland was 12 million. After it, it was 5 million. A lot of people came to America and Australia and other countries to get away, but a lot of people just straight up died. The reason that happened is because they were only allowed to grow one type of potato. The British that were controlling things only allowed them to grow one type, and they wouldn't let them change after the blight came. They did the same crop for 3 years in a row, so it got worse over time. But a story I heard from Ireland at that time was a whole village of people had the idea that in order to save their kids, what they were going to do is the parents were going to live off of the potato peelings and then fed the actual rest of the potato to their kids because they didn't want them to starve to death. Well, all their kids died of malnutrition and all the parents lived. So that, obviously the parents were eating a lot less than the kids because they're only eating the skins. And this also speaks a lot to the importance of nutrient density. Those kids were getting all the calories, a lot more calories than their bigger parents were, but the parents are the ones who lived. And it's because their bodies were probably running better because they had all the vitamins and nutrients that they needed. Potatoes, for example, have something like twice the potassium of bananas, but you have to eat the skin. So the skin's delicious. There's no reason to cut it off. You can eat just the potato skins and fry those, in some places. So eat the whole potato. Next on my list is, potatoes are a great mulch crop. You can actually just set them on the ground and mulch over the top of them. And I've grown them 5 different ways experimentally. And that was actually my most productive way to grow potatoes, was to just set them on the ground and mulch them. And I could pull the mulch back later on and pick the potatoes up off the ground. I didn't even have to dig them up hardly. Next on the list is kale. Kale is very cold tolerant, so if you're in Alaska or whatever, it's a good crop to do that with. It's very nutrient dense. It's not one of those big high bulk staples like potatoes are, but it's pretty good for a green, and it stays well if you dry it. Kale dries very, very well if you have a food dehydrator or you make one that utilizes the sun. A project I recommend doing. It's pretty simple to do. It's just a really hardy crop, and it's something that will keep you in greens through the dead of winter in a lot of America, and keep you vibrant and healthy. Greens, just right now we're in March. You shouldn't need to be buying any greens or growing any greens right now, because chances are you can find a patch of soil that's growing certain kinds of wild greens in your area. I recommend you looking up what those are and harvesting them. I brought home 3 big paper grocery bags of nettles just last night that I've just finished processing this afternoon to put in my freezer and in my food dryer. You can also freeze kale, obviously. I'm not leaning super hard into the foods that need to be frozen in order to last a long time, because I don't know that I'm going to have power through this whole thing. I don't trust that I necessarily will, and I definitely don't trust it for other natural disasters in my region. Wildfire is an issue. Earthquakes are a huge issue. Tsunami. Those are all things that could knock power out pretty swiftly. So I don't rely on my freezer any more than I have to, hopefully. Sweet potatoes is a crop that I am not really familiar with. I haven't actually grown them myself, and I don't know that they are as available to grow in as many regions of the United States as, say, regular potatoes are. But they're very nutritious, and they are also growing edible greens. So sweet potato leaves are edible. I don't know if that's also true of yams. Yams and sweet potatoes are actually not even distantly related. They're like different parts of the plant kingdom. But they look very similar, so people kind of call those different things even in the grocery store. So if you try to grow yams, I don't know that the greens on that will be edible. So make sure it's actually sweet potatoes that you're growing. But most of what I said about potatoes applies to sweet potatoes too. They store very well, they're versatile, they're delicious, and they're another one of those bright, if you get one of the bright orange ones, they're going to be high in vitamin A like the squash, like I mentioned earlier. So if you're in a region that you can grow those, I recommend it, and you're going to get tens of pounds of food potentially per plant with those. So lentils is another crop that's a legume that is kind of a fast growing legume. You can, in 110 days, you can go from having planted your crop to having a dried lentil, like ready to store dried. So that's a food that if you like lentils or they're good for your system, then